It's my pleasure today to introduce you to George Graham, philosopher and co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Philosophy and Psychiatry. So George, thank you for coming today.
My pleasure.
As a philosopher, how did you get into the field of psychiatry?
Well, the Vietnam War did it.
Really?
Yes, and here's how. During the Vietnam War, I was classified by the United States Selective Service as what was called a conscientious objector.
Okay.
And I was required to perform 2 years of something called civilian alternate work service
And what
instead of going into the military.
Okay.
And so I got a job working the night shift as an aide at New England Deaconess Hospital in Boston. 1 year I worked in medical surgical work, and 1 year I worked in psychiatric work. I worked in the psychiatric clinic.
Right.
It was at night.
Yeah.
There was only one other nurse there and over 30 patients.
Wow.
And there was me.
Oh my goodness.
I had a master's degree in philosophy from a Canadian university where I had gone because of the war.
Mm-hmm.
And I discovered something. I discovered that I could contribute to what was happening in the ward. There were a wide variety of different patients in the ward.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them had been subject to lobotomies.
Right.
Some were schizophrenic. Some were profoundly problematic. But there were also a whole class of people which are sometimes described as the worried well. These are people who in some way are functioning, but they have a pattern of psychiatric problems and they have a doctor who's giving them treatment.
Okay.
And when the doctor's there, which is a Harvard teaching hospital, so they were very good, and the nurses there saw me with my master's degree and heard me talk,
Yeah.
they didn't treat me like an aide.
Really?
They treated me as if I had something to contribute.
That's amazing.
And that was an exposure I had as a very young man. I was in my 20s. When I went to graduate school again to get a PhD, I specialized in the field of philosophy of mind. And in the back of my mind, I kept thinking, eventually I want to do something with psychiatry.
Yeah.
It stuck back there.
Yeah.
You know how sometimes things will just sit back there and come up again?
Yeah.
And so several years later, I got the opportunity to write a paper on depression. And I wrote a paper in a philosophy journal called Synthèse. The paper was called Melancholic Epistemology, which is meant to be a clever title.
Okay.
Esoteric, but clever. And it got quite a bit of publicity from
Right.
different people. And that's how I got started.
Okay.
I didn't start once I was, as it were, in the field. I started pre-field,
That's absolutely.
which is really important, by the way, Charlotte, because philosophers sometimes get the sense that I can be a philosopher and do the philosophy of X without having ever been part of X. So I can write about the philosophy of biology, even though I'm not a biologist and have never been in a biology lab. But I was actually in a psychiatric unit at a very distinguished hospital, taking care of patients, interacting with doctors. So even though that wasn't a very robust exposure, it really stimulated me to do that work later.
And it
in
was
my career.
for an extended period.
Oh
as
yes,
well,
a full
so,
year.
Yeah. So
Yes.
it's a long time. And what sort of? You said you were interacting with the patients. What sort of work were you doing with them?
Well, the patients were fascinating, and they were wonderful people. To give you an example, I took care of a Catholic priest who suffered from very severe delusions. Whether or not he was schizophrenic or not might be debated. He used to call me the devil. I would go in his room in the morning. He'd sometimes be under his bed, holding on to the bars in the bed, and he'd say, "I see the feet of Graham, the feet of the devil. Graham thinks he's an angel, but he's a devil." And then my job was to get him into the dining hall, so I would say things to him like, "I'm going to make you do something that'll show you I'm the devil," and he would laugh. I would sort of get him to laugh.
Yeah.
Okay. Oddly, because you wouldn't expect it, you would expect from some of the things he said that it exhibited a total absence of humor.
Yeah.
But he had that capacity. So one thing I would do is establish relationships with individual patients. I also participated in group therapy sessions. This was when I was shifted back into the day shift. And last but not least, they would listen to things I said as physicians, as a philosopher. They would ask me what they thought were philosophical questions. I had a master's degree.
Yeah.
They would ask me questions like, when we say that this particular patient on the chart has obsessions, what does that mean to you? And they would sort of try to tease me. I was in my early 20s. And you know, being a philosopher, I had an answer.
Yeah.
Even if I had to make it up.
Or if they didn't like it.
Even if they didn't like it, I would come out there and give them an answer. I was not humble, you know. And I'd do things like that. And it was an incredibly rich experience for me. I mean, a pivotal experience for my life. My father was a physician. He was an eye surgeon, so I knew something about medicine, but psychiatry just absolutely fascinated me.
Yeah, amazing. So why is it to you, given your experience, why do you think it's important to bring these two fields together?
Well, sometimes fields are brought together in a kind of arranged marriage. The couple doesn't know each other.
Yeah.
It is hoped by the culture that they'll develop affection for each other. They have a couple of kids, but it's not really working very well. Fields come together sometimes in academia that way. I used to do work in a big field called the cognitive science. And some of the fields that were in that field were part of arranged marriages. They didn't work together that well. Linguistics and neuroscience, for example, was never a very happy relationship.
Okay.
Philosophy and psychiatry, however, have the makings, and to some extent have always had it, of a very productive mutual relationship one with the other. And there are several reasons for this. I'll just mention two.
Okay.
One reason is that what you're concerned with as a philosopher is how the mind works when it's at its best. What you're concerned with as a psychiatrist is how the mind works when it's not at its best.
Yeah.
So you have these two disciplines, one of which specializes in bestness, and the other of which, to put things in simple terms, specializes in worseness.
Yeah, so two extremes.
And they learn from each other, ideally. They contribute to each other. If you look, for example, at the field of philosophy, you'll find a great deal of emphasis on this thing called rationality.
Okay.
And if you're looking at things from the perspective of a psychiatrist, you'll be concerned about someone's irrationality. So the play between these elements, you know. The second reason they come together, I think, is that they're each in their own way contributed to making people better, to improving the human condition.
Okay.
So it's not as if you're putting together engineering and philosophy, or psychiatry and baseball. Okay. You've got two fields that both historically and culturally are focused on improving a situation. So there's a common task.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can take two fields that might be able to interact, but they don't share the same task. And when you don't share the same task, the interaction is truncated and it's partial and it's not really working well. So there are other reasons, but those are the two. There's this interest in bestness and worseness,
Yeah.
and then there's the common goal that the two disciplines share.
So they both provide each other.
Yeah.
They're mutually
Exactly,
beneficial.
exactly. And there are other things, like they've had a historical relationship at times, which has been very important. If you look at the history of philosophy, people like William James and others who were philosophers contributed to work on mental illness. If you look at the history of psychiatry, people like Jaspers and Freud had philosophic things to say. So there are a variety of other reasons, but those, I think, are the two most important for putting the fields together. But it takes skill putting fields together. It just doesn't happen automatically.
Like a marriage.
Yes, you need a minister. You just can't stand there and go, I do, right?
Yeah.
What do you do? I don't know what I do, but I'm here, right?
Exactly.
You need someone to put things together.
And my final question, George, is where do you see the field going?
I like to look at sort of 10-year predictions.
Okay.
And the way I see things developing is primarily for the best. And what I mean by that is, not only do I expect the interactions to be more various and more robust, but I also see genuine advances intellectually and theoretically in the field. One reason I have that optimism is because of the young people who are getting interested in working in the field. I hear from people myself all over the world who write me and say, where can I do graduate work in philosophy and psychiatry in the United States or in England? I read such and such a book. I have a father who suffers from such and such a problem. I want to do something about this. And some years ago, I was involved in a field called cognitive science, where I also saw young people getting involved, and it had a profoundly positive impact on the field. They're making an investment of themselves and their careers in the field. There are also changes taking place in the culture that I feel are going to help the field grow and help the field develop. I mean, it's very difficult if you're an academic to work as if you're an island, divorced from the continent that's supporting you. And if the continent is changing, if there's shifts taking place in the surrounding society and environment, they can help you. One shift that I think is taking place, which is extraordinarily useful, is the so-called user movement, where people who are patients under psychiatric care or persons that have psychiatric problems are taking a stand on who they are, who they want, what labels are they willing to deploy to themselves, what kind of care are they expecting from people. This is a wonderful development because it illustrates that you're taking care of a person and not just a patient.
And that's a great thing about the handbook, because we bring that user voice to the fore. And
yes, the handbook brings that to the fore. And the handbook does something else too, which I think is going to take place more and more in the future. People are learning that the status quo can be an object of hearty, productive criticism. Okay. That the way a field develops, say the field of psychiatry, for example, if it becomes ever more reliant on medication for everything, or thinks it has to model itself on some other field like neuroscience, that's not necessarily a healthy development. And by having a handbook and the ongoing interaction of young people in the field with older people, you get that critical perspective, which is really central to proper growth. And earlier we spoke of, an arranged marriage.
Yes.
And one of the things that characterizes an arranged marriage that never becomes more is couples don't know each other well enough to be comfortable criticizing each other and helping each other. But that's already been established in the fields of philosophy and psychiatry, which is a wonderful development.
I really enjoyed talking to you.
Okay.
Thank you.